morning we have another one of those great and wonderful stories from the Old Testament. Probably a story that every one of you are familiar with. You've heard it before. The story of Daniel in the lion's den. For many of us, when we're children, it's a favorite story for us to read because it's kind of an adventure story. And it has all kinds of drama in it. And so it's a story that's familiar to us. But I would suggest that perhaps just like the story of Jonah that we listened to a few weeks ago, this is a story in which we perhaps don't really know the beginning of the story. What we know is the dramatic ending of Daniel in the lion's den and being saved, and that's a wonderful thing for us to know, but there is a beginning of this story that makes it all meaningful, and there is a beginning of this story that puts it in the context of God's people in the Old Testament that we've been looking. And I think it speaks a word to us in our own time. It's a contemporary kind of word that we get. And so we need to focus on the front end of this story if we are to hear the message that God wants for us. We have been tracing the story of God and God's people. It's a wonderful and exciting story. God has created human beings just like you and I, and God has given us all kinds of gifts in this world, and God has created us to be significant people who make a difference, who matter to the world and matter to God. We've been tracing that story along. And as we trace that story along, there's perhaps been an inevitability that is happening here. God has been creating a community of people who know God, who trust God, and are called to be faithful to God. That's what God has been about, and part of that story, of course, is that God is attending to this community of people that He has gathered together to reach out to all the rest of the world. God is about the whole story, not just a select group, but all the same. It's inevitable, I suppose, that somewhere along the line of that story, this community of God's people, in the case of Daniel, this Old Testament community of God's people, called to know God, called to be faithful, called to be witnesses, called to be expressing of their worship and praise of God, that community would come into conflict with the community of the world around it. That inevitably trouble will happen. And that's the context of this story, of course. There's Daniel, who is God's faithful one, God's faithful witness, placed in a circumstance where he is in deep conflict with the world around him. In fact, the world around Daniel is jealous of him and seeks to do him in. And so the conflict unfolds about Daniel and those who are opposed to God. What is Daniel to do when the interdict is given? Seems like it's just a short time, perhaps, only 30 days. Only 30 days to either do this in secret, maybe, or to stop altogether. What would it matter? We can always pick it up again later, can't we? And so what is Daniel to do when the interdict comes? Daniel, you have to stop praying to God. You have to stop being faithful, even just for a short time. Just stop, Daniel, and all will be well. Of course, Daniel cannot do that. And so the story has its drama in it. You know, Daniel doesn't go into his closet, like Jesus says, to go to your closet when you pray. Daniel goes and prays in front of the big window, in the bay window of his house, where all can see, because Daniel intends to be faithful. And of course, you know how the story is going to go. Daniel is in conflict, and now Daniel will wind up paying the price for his faithfulness. And I would suggest that all of us know at the beginning of this story, as we go forward with it now, Daniel had no idea that God would spare him from the lion's den. I suspect Daniel knew that what all the rest of us know, and that is likely when he is thrown into that den, that will be the end. but he will have been faithful. The miracle in the story, of course, is that God intervenes, that God is with Daniel, that God spares Daniel, and that Daniel is saved through the episode in the den. That Daniel's faith is vindicated. So what about you and me? And what about the carrying of this story forward? Actually, it's probably important for us as Christian people to recognize another thing in this story. It was not at all in the mind of the writer of the book of Daniel, I don't think. But did you catch it as you heard this story? And as you heard that gospel reading for today? Jesus is a lot like Daniel in some senses. Jesus is also one who came into conflict with the powers that be around him. And Jesus also is one who is sent to the place of death, the crucifixion. In the story of Jesus, though, God does not stop the death. It is not like Daniel, who is saved in the lion's den, but the Son of God, Jesus, suffers and dies, is put to death. It's like as if the lions would have grabbed him and taken him and done what lions do. And did you catch it? If Daniel goes in the lion's den, a rock is placed in front, a seal is put on it, a signet seal that says you can't move the stone. Daniel can't be rescued. You have to break the king's interdict. Do you remember? They put Jesus, dead Jesus, inside a tomb, and they sealed it with the ring so that it could not be broken. But God broke the seal. God broke the barrier. God did not spare Jesus from death, but he raised him to new life. That's part of the story. And now we need to take it to our own life, because you and I are now a community. God has called us to be a community that is faithful to worshiping God, faithful in a world that sometimes is opposed to all of that. Now, I would suggest to us that our situation is different from Daniel, and it's probably different from Jesus too. Truth of the matter is, none of us are much worried about anybody throwing us in the lion's den for our prayers. It's not going to happen. That's not our context. We don't live in that kind of world. We can be thankful for that we're not in that kind of world. Perhaps there are people who are, but not us. So we have to think of this story maybe a little bit differently than that. We live in a different context, but none the same. Our faith, our trust, our belief, our action, our witness for God in this world does come into conflict with the powers of the world around us. How might that be? I think in this season of Advent, there's a subtle way in which everything that it means for us to be a Christian, to be coming up to Christmas time, is set in jeopardy by the world around us. Last weekend was a powerful weekend in our country. Starting with Black Friday, Small Business Saturday, Cyber Monday, and in it all, there is a voice speaking in our world that calls us to materialism. I remember it even as a kid. We didn't have all those days, but I tell you what, when the Sears Roebuck and the JCPenney's catalog came, this little boy sat down and dreamed of all the toys. Everything. I had them all marked, many pages. I was smart enough to know my mom and dad weren't going to give me all of them, but I hope they give me a few. It's always there, isn't it? This call of the world to settle into what the world would have us think is important probably was a good thing for our country, that a lot of money got spent over that weekend. We needed a boost. But on the other hand, was it really a good thing? Or was it just one more sign of how the world has its claws on us? And so you and I are called upon to step forward, to stand forward, to have the wisdom, I guess, to know what it is consequences to our faith. I want to tell you clearly, I'm not against gift giving. It's a good thing. But maybe it gets carried way out of hand. And maybe our values get twisted out of hand. And there maybe are other things. You know them better than I, because you live more out there in that world. I spend most of my time inside this building or in your home someplace, and I don't have that same perspective maybe. But you know those places where the world will draw you away from God. The story of Daniel tells you and me, stand firm. Express your faith. Pray to God. Worship. Be faithful. It may get us into trouble. Probably not in the lion's den. It may get us into trouble. But God calls us to be faithful anyway. And that's what the message of the story of Daniel is for God's people. To stand firm in the face of aversion, in the face of trouble.